So now we get to talk about the final kingdom, the New Kingdom. At the end of the Middle Kingdom, they once again had another intermediary period. So that's the second intermediary period. As I mentioned, the Middle Kingdom was always a time when things never really gelled back together for them. There were very minor pharaohs during this time, really not a lot of prosperity, just sort of this weak, right, sort of sense of Egyptianness, I guess. The intermediate period then hit, and after that intermediate period, right before the New Kingdom, you actually have the invasion of outsiders, the Hyksos. And who are the Hyksos? They are an Asian people. So they're coming from the region that today we'd say is Asia, into this region and end up conquering the Egyptians. How did they end up conquering them? Basically, the best explanation I have for it is that the Egyptians had been pretty insular in their thinking. They had really not looked at the outside world in general or gave it much cause for concern. They had, roughly traded with the African nations below them, like Nubia, but overall, they really weren't looking at the wider, broader picture of the world and were very insular in their thinking. So when these people show up from Asia, they're sort of like, well, who are these people? Like, oh, now they're attacking us. Oh, that's bad. Oh, now they've won. So I would say that they just were not prepared, right, for an outside invader like this. But they do learn from them. I always say that, one of the things that the Egyptians were really good at was learning. They really looked at what was in front of them and tried to make sense of it. So they learned from the militaristic attitude of the Hyksos and, in a sense, turned that back around on them to eject them right from Egypt. Some of the things that the Hyksos had been doing was using more advanced weaponry, using horses in warfare so they could be more mobile, more nimble. So the Egyptians learned from these tactics and adopted them in a sense, and then used them back at the Hyksos to drive them out. And this changes their attitude again. So during the Old Kingdom, I would say they're very prosperous and their lives are very stable. They're worshiping Ra, everything is very good. The Middle Kingdom, things aren't great, but it's just sort of kind of plodding along. They're worshiping Osiris now more so. And then you get to the New Kingdom and they become much more militaristic and individualistic in their thinking, kind of, I need to be looking out for myself. And so if you look at this art piece, you'll notice that Ramses III, one of the later pharaohs of the New Kingdom, is being crowned by Horus and Seth. Horus, of course, we've seen a number of times. He protects the pharaoh during life. Seth, the killer of Osiris, the god of chaos, how did he end up here? Because Seth, really is considered a bad god throughout Egyptian history. He's the killer of Osiris. To me, he was probably the kind of god that you invoked to Egyptian children to make them behave, like you better go to bed or Seth's gonna come get you. Kind of a boogeyman, kind of thing, probably. He's never very celebrated in the art or the culture until the New Kingdom comes around. And we think it's because he's a god of chaos and this is a more chaotic time. So lean on the gods that are going to support what's happening at the time. So, it's Ra, Old Kingdom, right? Osiris, Middle Kingdom, Seth, New Kingdom. And so, in a lot of ways, their polytheism is very similar to Mesopotamian polytheism, where they have this roster of gods. They have all these multitudes of gods, but notice that sometimes they're focusing on one over one than the other. They're kind of looking at one as being more dominant. Just like in the Mesopotamian city-state system, that city-state would hold up a certain god as more important. So notice that these polytheisms are very interesting because there's multiple gods running around, but in a sense, often one is sort of privileged over another. But why Seth? Chaos, right? And I always say when I think of the art to show you in the New Kingdom, I'm going to be showing you art that relates to much more unusual pharaohs, more independent kind of thinkers. There's going to be a lot of weird moves that happen during the New Kingdom. Everything's a little bit more chaotic. And so we start here by looking at Akhenaten, who actually originally was named Amenhotep. And I gave you the names so you can kind of see them. Now, why is his original name important? Because originally his name invoked the sun god Ra. Ra was often referred to as Amun Ra or Amun Ra, as you see here. If you've ever wondered where the word amen comes from, now you know. This is why I say it's important to study religion across the course of time because a lot of times religions adopt things. This is why we study comparative religion to understand where things come from. So in sun god worship, if you look at sun god prayers, they're very much like Amun Ra, blessings to the sun, Amun, Amun, Amun. And Amun or Amen becomes Amen, and translates into, again, a worshipful statement later on in the monotheistic religions of the West. So, again, I always think this is interesting to consider. But Amun or Aman was related to Ra. So he was originally named after the sun god. Well, he wanted to change the worship to a single god, the god Aten. If you look at the last four letters of his name, Aten, this is the god he wanted to worship. And what is the god Aten? The god Aten is the sun disk in the sky. I'll show you a slide in a minute that will make this more apparent. And you might say, well, wait a minute, Ra is the sun god. We already have a sun god. And I'd say, yes, you're correct. He was the creator, he was the sun god. Aten is a separate idea entirely. It's the sun disk as you see it in the sky. And here's the interesting part. He wanted Aten to be the only god that Egyptians worshipped. So rather than have a polytheism, he was introducing a monotheism or a one god system of worship. I told you before, early people thought this was crazy. You need lots of gods to do lots of things. So, how do you think they sort of looked at Akhenaten? They looked at him as being a crazy person. And there's a reason why he's assassinated after only 30 years of rule, 30 ish years of rule, because you can't do this to a people. One thing I'll tell you over and over about cultural change is you have to do it in gradual bits, in drips and drabs. Any kind of major change you ever want to do in this world, you have to make sure it's sort of gradual because if you do something very quickly, people will react very sharply to that. They will say, well, whoa, wait a minute. What just happened? If you sort of just keep raising the temperature, it's like boiling the frog in that water, if you've ever heard that equivalency. That you can boil a frog in water if you just keep raising the temperature, because our bodies adjust to the temperature and then, or a frog's body adjusts to the temperature. And you can literally boil them alive without them knowing it. So all changes need to be gradual. This is how you get people to accept something. I also compare it to like when you get in a swimming pool, unless you're the anomaly who cannonballs in, which, that's your thing, I guess. But most of us, we put a toe in and go, ooh, it's kind of maybe a little cold, right? Then we edge in, let's get a little better. We go in gradually. And then once we're in the pool, people standing on the pool deck, say, ooh, how's the water? And we say, it's a little cold at first, but it's nice when you get in. So, we adjust to something gradually typically. Akhenaten made the big mistake of doing this suddenly saying to them, you're going to worship one God. And also think about the people he disenfranchised. All the priests and the priestesses who were running around worshiping Sobek, worshiping Bast, worshiping Hathor. These people had nothing to do now. He literally took a very privileged class of Egyptian society and made them worthless. They're not going to like that. Let me tell you, don't take away anyone's privilege. They will fight you about it. Or you better be ready for it, is all I'm saying. Because again, we don't like giving up things that make us have status or hierarchy. That's not something we do willingly typically. So he made a lot of little mistakes here, a lot of little boo-boos, and he will end up paying for it. The other thing I'll mention, looking at his pharaonic portrait here, is notice that he's going away from the canon of proportions and style. Instead of that stiff rigidity that we see over and over and over again, that canon of proportions, knows there's a curviness, a softness to the body. And that's something that a lot of Akhenaten scholars cite. And they wonder about it. What is this meant to mean? Is it meant to mean that he and his family look this way? Because we've moved on to the stele of Akhenaten here, where his wife Nefertiti is present. His children are shown present in the image. Notice they're all curvy, they're all soft. So scholars say, is this meant to tell us this is what he looked like? Or is this a symbolic thing? Because again, think about it. Art's always been a very symbolic, stylized thing since the beginning of prehistory. I would argue that I don't think they looked this way. I think it was to signal again that change. He's making a change in the gods. He's making a change in the style of the art. He's changing everything, right? With the kind of choices that he's making. Now looking here, I told you I'd show you what the sun disk looks like. So again, if you look up at the top of the stele, you'll notice this idea of the Aten as the sun disk in the sky. And notice how its rays kind of come down like almost like their little hands, like they're gonna pet Akhenaten and Nefertiti, right? They're gonna hello, caressing them, right? And I also always point out the use of the family here is very unusual. Most Egyptian pharaohs don't show even their wives, much less their families. We had mentioned that Menkaure, that was a very odd thing for him to include his wife in his portraiture, because again, usually women were private, they weren't shown publicly. So here to show the family in such a loving way was also very much a very big departure to show something artistically. And the hierarchy of scale here is you'll notice Akhenaten and Nefertiti kind of have the same hierarchy. The children are shown smaller, but kind of realistically proportionally. Now, if you go look at other types of art within Egypt that show families, usually, again, the father is the biggest, the mother a little less big, right, and the children shown very small. It's usually a very stark hierarchy of scale, right, that you see displayed. Now, as I mentioned, Akhenaten's reign will end badly for him um, because of a lot of the things he decided, right, regarding the worship of the gods. One of the things, of course, is that there would be no priests and priestesses of all these different gods. The only priest and priestess of Aten were actually Nefertiti and Akhenaten themselves. Nefertiti, you'll notice, is always wearing what we call the blue crown of Aten worship. So she's always shown wearing the blue crown in a sense that signifies she is a priestess, right, of Aten, that she is related to Aten worship, and that she is aligned with that signification, right, of Aten as dominant. Um, and she's the only one to wear it because, again, the Aten worship was very short lived, right? One thing I always like bringing up about this piece is that it's very, very famous, but it actually was found in the trash pile of the artist Thutmose, who created it. So, someone's trash is someone else's treasure, right? And a lot of people talk about how she maybe doesn't look exactly Egyptian, but perhaps she actually was Hyksos, that she was an outsider. So there's different theories that people throw around about this portrait, related to, what is Nefertiti's background? Where does she come from? So those are some interesting things if you like sort of the story of Nefertiti and researching her. And eventually, as I mentioned, Akhenaten is assassinated, which will lead us to our discussion of Tut, who basically takes over after this assassination. For a while, we thought he was his nephew. Now we're pretty sure it was actually his son. There's still some competing research going on there, showing you kind of the lack of some information that we have sometimes. So some scholars still don't completely agree. But one thing you'll notice is that Tut right away says, no more Aten worship, right? So look at his name, and there you see he's gone back to the old ways.